What's going on, guys? Welcome in. It has been about 1 week since OP-03 has started at the time of this recording of the video. And if you're anything like me, you're probably wondering, what should I be playing for the rest of this meta? That is a very loaded question, as obviously the metas change, but I figured why not give my opinion, as many have already done on YouTube, about what is strong and what is not on the OP-03 tier list. And so we'll go through this tier list and kind of list out what leaders you should probably be playing around and what leaders you should avoid if you're wanting to be a successful one-piece player in OP-03. The way that I'm doing my ranking is I have 5 different rankings, as you can see. We have in the top tier, meta-defining. Below that, event toppers. These are decks that will be, might win a tournament or so, but probably aren't going to be built, have tech built around them. B tier is competitive, so these will be strong contenders, but probably will have a little bit of struggle trying to get to the top of events. C being leave it locals. Those are decks that might win some games, but probably are not going to be too competitive or win an event that is 500 people plus. And then F for free AF. So probably should leave them alone until, I don't know, unless you're feeling brave, I guess. So the way that we're going to rank these out is we're going to go through in order of when these decks have come out. So we're going to go through OP01, OP02, and then OP03. And we'll try to get through this rather fast. As like I said, there have been quite a few tier lists out there. So if you've seen one, you've probably seen them all. Obviously, we know probably what's going to be at the top, but let's see how I do in comparison to others. So starting off the bat, we're going to go with Luffy. Luffy in OP02 was really strong. It had a lot of good removal. It played really well. It had great Dawn efficiency. The problem with this deck going into OP03, there's a lot more red leaders that do things better. So Zoro, for instance, is a leader that has much more Dawn efficient turns. Newgate, which stacks tall characters and swings hard and can defend itself well. And then you have Ace, which uses its ability to be able to pitch events or just kind of play a little bit more mid-range control. So Luffy has like a really weird identity crisis going into OP03, as all the other red leaders rather, kind of do it better than Luffy. I think it's a strong competitive deck. So I'm going to put it in the B tier. I'm going to put it towards, like, as of right now, probably towards the tail end of the B tier. And just so we're clear going forward for this video, I'm probably not going to be listing them out as far as like within the tier how strong they are, unless it's like S or A. Because like B might be a little bit thick. It's probably going to be a little bit of a thick category, I would imagine. So there's actually quite a few competitive decks, I think, in this format. But Luffy, I'd say, falls from like an event topper to competitive for OP03. Moving on to Croc, I actually think Croc got some improvement, a few extra cards in its arsenal for this meta. So replacing the 7-cost Doflamingo is now Sogeking, which is a counter. Obviously, it's a little bit less of a power, but it allows you to draw 2, discard 2, which is strong, and it bounces a 6-cost. Also, I think it's 3000 Sword is the name of the card, or something along those lines. It's just a great removal for a lot of the Marcos out there, both the blocker and the KO Marco. So I say Croc is probably towards competitive, towards the top of it. It might be an event topper depending on how strong or how consistent or how lucky the Croc player gets. I think it's a really strong deck, don't get me wrong, but I don't know if it's going to top an event quite yet. So I'm going to put it towards the top of the competitive tier list. I know I just said that I'm not going to be listing them out as far as like where they stand within their own rankings, but I think maybe we'll just like loosely do it for some of these. Next up is Kid. I think Kid could be an event topper, actually. I think Kid is one of those decks that it's just a strong leader effect. Both the Film Kid and the Supernova variant have their advantages, and I think can be played and win events. I think out of the two, I want to say that the Supernova package probably is a little bit stronger, just because you're going to see a lot of Zoro and you're going to see a lot of Newgate in these events. And Zoro struggles against 8-cost Kid, and I think that Newgate hates seeing 8-cost Kid tapped with a bunch of blockers on the field, because you're wasting your time trying to kill something that might not be killed. So Newgate struggles a little bit with that. And that being said, when Newgate's like swinging into the 8-cost Kid, the leader kid can then use its ability to kind of like pop off and take a lot of cards out of the Newgate's hand. So I say that Kid is actually going to be an event topper, probably Supernova, maybe the film package. Both are strong, but it's not necessarily the strongest A tier deck. It is a strong deck. We'll probably see it do well though. Following up with OP01 starter decks is Kaido. I'm leaving it at the locals. That's where I'm going to leave it at. I think the problem with Kaido is that Kaido's strengths got nullified in OP03 with the introduction of the 5-cost Marco. What Kaido likes to do is pop the board. Well, when you're popping a board and it can be resurrected, it's a little bit hard for Kaido to keep up with that. So it kind of feels like a waste to pop things at that level. So I'd say Kaido didn't get a lot of support. Other decks got support to kind of like combat with what Kaido does. And on top of that, the leader ability for Kaido, -7 to essentially banish a card or trash the top card of your opponent's life. Yellow just does that better. Yellow has at least 3 different ways to do that with like Soul Pocus, the 7-cost Big Mom, or the 10-cost Big Mom. And so because of that, you might as well just play yellow instead of Kaido. Unfortunately, purple just didn't get a lot of support this set. So I'm going to put Kaido at the C, leave it locals tier. It's not free. Don't get me wrong. Kaido can still win, but it's an uphill battle for sure. All right, on to the actual OP01 leaders, not the starter deck, but the actual leaders from OP01 boxes. Zoro, clearly meta-defining. Everyone builds a deck around Zoro or is playing Zoro. I think it is probably towards the top of the S tier, if not the #1 deck in the meta. It is a menace. It has always been a menace. OP01, OP02, and on to OP03. It continuously just gets support, and it's just one of those decks where it's like, it pulls out wins. You can build it in many different ways. There's different variants to it now. Like there's a Teach one, there's the Rush one, and then the Whitebeard package. All of those are strong, and you can probably win with any of them against any deck. So obviously, because of that, Zoro is meta-defining. Next up, we're going to have Law, which is also another OP01 leader, which I consider to be meta-defining. I think this deck, although it didn't get any support technically for OP03, it is still in the hands of a good player, will continuously pop off. It is one of those decks that it will stay here for a while. I think in OP04, we're going to continue to see it, even though it probably doesn't get much support. It doesn't need it. It just is a good deck all around. It knows what it's doing. It has great searchers. It's one of those decks that I think when the developers of this game made the rules, they were thinking about Law in mind. It is one of those decks that just, it doesn't struggle. I don't think the only struggle with Law is like yourself. Law players struggle with themselves. They don't struggle with the decks they're playing against. If you get a bad hand, then that's when you're screwed. And that's not on the opponent, that's on you. So yeah, because of that, Law is S tier. Next up, we're gonna put Luffy, the red-green variant, down at the Leave It Locals, probably above Kaido or around that level. I just don't think it's one of those decks that it feels great when you're spending your Dawn on the ability. 4 Dawn to restand something and swing again for plus 1k, that's expensive. As we found as we go along, it is one of those, like Dawn efficiency is super important to the game, and because of it, Luffy just doesn't cut it, I don't think. There's not a lot of support that it got, and on top of that, just play like Law if you're gonna go red-green. Honestly, I think Luffy eventually might see some play down the road if there's more support for it. I'd like to see this card or this leader be able to be viable in a competitive scene, but as of right now, I just don't think it's quite there. As for Odin, I don't think Odin is an event topper, but I think Odin is competitive. I would put Odin about right here, and I'm saying that like Croc is strong and Luffy's strong. Odin is also strong when Odin sees what it needs. There's quite a few different combos that Odin can play, and speaking of Dawn efficiency, this deck really maximizes the amount of Dawn that you can use to really pop off in a setting. And like in any kind of game that you're playing with, if you see the right cards you need, this deck can do really well, and I would consider it competitive. It might throw some people off when they're playing at it in like a regional or a treasure cup, but I don't know. I don't think it's quite there to be able to win an event. I could be wrong. And if I'm wrong, I hope someone proves me wrong, because if somebody wins with this, that's awesome. I really want to see this leader do well. Obviously, Odin is a really cool character in the series, but as far as the card goes, it's strong, but not event topper strong, in my opinion. Next up, we have Doflamingo. I would put Doflamingo That's tough. I actually think Croc is probably the strongest blue leader. So I'm going to put Doflamingo right below it. I think these two are interchangeable. Obviously, they got the same support. However, the way that Croc plays allows Croc to play that support a little bit easier, because what Doflamingo is doing is a little bit more Dawn intensive. Spending 2, paying 1 to swing 7 and then get a body on board is great. However, you don't have a lot of Dawn early to mid to be able to play some of the events like the 4-cost 3000 sword, or like Mihawk takes your entire turn sometimes. So because of that, I would put Doflamingo just below Croc. It's still really strong though. I think that it gives red some decent problems. Obviously in OP02, Doflamingo was really strong against Newgate because of the natural 7 into 6. That continues to be a strong point for Doflamingo, and you're also getting a body on board. However, we didn't see too many Warlords thrown into OP03. I don't think we saw any, to be honest. So because of that, I'm going to put it just below Croc, because Croc technically can use the event and the 7-cost Soga King a little bit better than Doflamingo can. As far as blue-purple Croc and blue-purple Kaido, they didn't get enough support. I'm going to do these two together because they're very similar as far as like the support that they got is kind of non-existent, other than obviously for Croc, the 3000 swords. I'm going to put it at Leave It Locals. I don't think it's quite there yet. I don't think it's free. I think that these decks can win in certain scenarios, but I don't think that they're ever free. So I'm going to put these down here towards the bottom of C tier. I just don't think that they're quite competitive. Locals might struggle a little bit. If you take them to a local, have fun with it there, but don't take it anywhere else, in my opinion. Next up, King. This is the meme deck of all of One Piece card game. It's free. It's a free deck. If you go against a King, the effect is not really there. Just play any other purple deck for now. Hopefully we'll see something down the line where we can stop putting this in the free tier. And obviously some people will say, oh, you know what? You're wrong. You can actually win with this and do well. Go for it. Please do. Show me that you did well with it. I'd like to see that. And speaking of free, we're also going to put Uta in the free tier because this is probably the worst red deck out there. I think they just try to make something for the film package that they put out there for during OP01. There's no way. I'm going to put it above King. I think that it does have some... Can I put it above King? Yeah, I can. Okay. Let me just back up real fast. I think Uta has some place in some meta eventually. I don't think it's there yet. I think that the effect of being able to pump up a vanilla, and only one vanilla is the problem. If it was pumping up all your vanillas, that'd be great. However, it doesn't do that. So because it only pumps up one, it's not really that great of an effect. You might as well just play another red deck and get a better effect somewhere else. So because of that, I think Uta is going to be an F tier. Watch me lose to it, and I'll change the tier after that. Speaking of, I've seen next up on the list, Purple Shanks, the film Shanks. I have seen people put this in F tier, and you know what's embarrassing? Is that I actually lost to this deck in a Treasure Cup last set in OP02. Simply because I just didn't know what some of the cards did. I attacked into a character, and they played in an event where the character could not be KO'd, and I was like, what the hell is going on? So because of that, I'm going to put Shanks at a Leave It Locals. I don't think it's competitive. I don't think it's free, simply because... Maybe I'm free, simply because I lost to it. But I think Purple Shanks probably can go around here, around this area. I think it's a little bit better than these two other decks right now on blue-purple. I don't know if it's better than Kaido overall, because Kaido has a really strong package with some of the impel down. But I think the effect that Shanks uses to pump up all of its characters is pretty strong. I admittedly... Against like a Whitebeard, you're gonna see this and you're gonna be like, oh cool, it's probably free, it's Purple Shanks as Whitebeard. And then they start pumping up their characters and you're like, oh, what the hell? I have to drop a bunch of cards? That's wild. So I'm gonna leave it at C, Leave It Locals, towards the bottom or middle of the pack right now. It's not that good of a deck, don't get me wrong. I'm probably just a trash player. Next up we have Sakazuki. I've seen some people actually put this higher up towards like the competitive tier. I don't think it's there. Paying 3 Dawn to KO something is all right, but I think you're trashing a card from hand and you're not establishing a body, and you're going to probably be playing the Navy version. And in this meta, in OP03, it rewards players that play aggressively, that put bodies on the board and can start pressuring life early. And I don't think Sakazuki really does that. I will put it the F tier. I'm going to put it free, but I could see it. I could see it possibly move up to like a Leave It Locals tier, like a C tier. I don't think it's competitive. Definitely not event topper, and definitely not meta defining. So we're gonna put it at free right now. There probably is gonna be some people that are upset at that, but I'm sorry. This is my list. Next up, obviously, is probably the #1 meta defining deck, Newgate himself, Papa Whitebeard. I'm gonna put him around second. I think that Zoro does a really good job of draining Newgate's cards from hand. Newgate is just a strong 6k swing every turn, which is nuts, and you're getting card draw off of its effect, right? And the bodies that you're playing down on every turn are strong and hard for your opponent to pop or kill or whatever it may be. The decks that do really strong against it are the decks that can kill them without swinging into it. So like any black deck is really good here. And so if you're a Whitebeard player, you don't want to see like a Lucci, or you don't want to see like a Smoker or even a Z. But you're not going to be seeing a lot of those at competitive events, and possibly not even that many at locals. So because of that, Whitebeard kind of reigns free a little bit. I think it has a really good matchup into most of these decks that are on the list already. It does well. It does okay against Law. It does okay against Zoro. You can play and win both of those matchups just fine. You can also play and lose both of those matchups. I think that it's I wouldn't say it's a balanced deck per se, but I think it's probably one of the strongest decks, almost #1 in my opinion. I think a lot of people are going to have to play around it and learn how to play around it, and because of that, it's meta defining. That being said, I do see why they banned Moby Dick because of Izo being in the meta, searching out any Whitebeard card. I'm so glad that they banned it, because like that's just an instant win for anybody that's playing this deck. I understand now why it's banned. So regardless, it's still an S tier, even with Moby Dick removed from the meta. Next up, we're going to talk about Garp, Red-Black Garp. I think this one's a Leave It Locals. I don't really see... There wasn't much synergy between Red and Black for the last set, and there's not really a lot this set either. It is a deck that can win against some of these decks and can take people by surprise, but I don't see it... I just don't see it doing that well, especially for life. Using the effects that don't really synergize kind of is a struggle. I'm going to say that it's probably towards the top of the Leave It Locals, simply because it did do well in OP02, and there's probably some people that have been practicing with it and know the matchups well to do okay with it in OP03. But overall, it's one of those decks that I think is a rogue deck, but probably is not going to do too well. I don't think it's that competitive. Next up, we have Ivankov. Ivankov is one that didn't get any support, really. I mean, not much support. The same support that Croc and Doflamingo got, but the struggle with Ivankov is that it wants to play with a low hand size, which is kind of counterintuitive to the game. And on top of that, you thought that Doflamingo had trouble with Dawn efficiency using some of these other events and other high-cost cards. Ivankov has an even worse problem with that, because it has a very specific curve that it's trying to follow. And if it doesn't hit that curve, then it pretty much is an auto lose. Here's the one thing, if Ivankov does see its curve and can lay out what it needs, it's a hard deck to beat. Don't get me wrong. If you lose to this deck, it might have been just like a variance and it does really well. That being said, I don't think it's a very competitive deck. I think that the other two blue leaders with Croc and Doflamingo are probably a little bit better. I'm going to put it at the Leave It Locals. I just don't see it being super competitive in the OP03 meta as compared to these other two blue decks. So yeah. Next up is Sanji. I almost want to put Sanji in free. However, it can spam the board and probably handle some decks a little bit better. It does play a lot of event counters, which I have admittedly struggled against when going into the sim. Still pull out the wins, but it's just one of those where it's like, what do you have in your hand? You have so much stuff in your hand. You have all this open Dawn. What's going on? I'm going to say leave it at locals. I would say it's probably above Shanks, below Kaido, if I had to guess. It is a deck that is okay with Dawn efficiency and can put some big bodies on the field, but it doesn't have a huge hand size, and the card draw for this deck, I think there are builds that have put card draw into it, which has helped it out tremendously. But that being said, I don't know if it's quite there yet. That being said, I did forget, Sanji's Peel-Off can be played in any of the blue decks, which is an amazing card. It's basically what? Pot of Greed for one piece. So what does Pot of Greed do? Draw 2 cards. So essentially it's the same thing here. So I forgot about that. All of the blue decks do get a little bit more card draw. Don't know if that's huge, big enough for any of these to be bumped up to any higher tiers, but it is really good support for these blue decks at least. Next up we have Kinemon. This deck, I think Kinemon fell off. It was one of those decks where in the Japanese meta, or in the Asian meta rather, there was a lot of Kinemon in OP02, and I feel like we didn't see enough of it in OP02 for the English meta. It's one of those where I expected a lot of Kinemon, and instead we saw Zoro, Law, Luffy, and instead of Kinemon being the de facto green leader, we saw a lot more Kid with the film variants pop up. I think Kinemon is going to be competitive, probably higher tier than Odin. It still has some strong cards. It still plays really, really control the board-esque type play, but I don't think it's quite an event topper. I don't think it can, in 9 rounds of a tournament, beat these decks over and over and over again consistently. So I'm going to put it in the competitive, but not event topper tier. Next up is Magellan. Magellan is a little bit spicy in the sense that I think it's an event topper deck. I think this deck is well-rounded and well-suited for what it needs to do. It has a lot of weird cards, a lot of ways to cheat out these weird cards, like your banishing cards, your double attack cards, your blockers. It's very defensive. It walls up well. The event counter that minuses 3,000 on your opponent 2 characters or a leader in character, Hell's Judgment, is really strong and annoying to play against. And of course, the really strong factor as to why I think Magellan is a event topper deck is it consistently can throw off Whitebeard players. I'm going to put it at the lower end of event toppers right now. The thing is with Magellan, it's naturally going to be getting 1,000 power every time because it's going to be using its minusing effect on something that it plays. And on top of that, its 5 cost Magellan will throw off, like I said, the Whitebeard player. So if you're going to go first, you play your Magellan, your 5 cost on curve, and now Newgate comes out a turn later. Or if your opponent's going first, now essentially Newgate comes out a turn later, and by playing that 5 cost, you essentially have taken a life from Newgate, which is really strong. And I think this deck does well against other decks in the meta. I think it can potentially hold its own against Zoro. I think it might struggle against Law a little bit. I do see these meta-defining decks beating it, but there are times where I can see this deck finding what it needs, drawing the nuts, and winning the game from there. So I'm going to put it in an event topper. That's probably going to be my one spicy tier list ranking here. We'll see. We'll see what else we come across. All right, so Z, I think Z is one of those that was a boogeyman for me last set. I didn't like to play against it. It was, you're basically going against a clock. Once it hits 10 dawn, it basically can win the game from there. However, like I said, this meta is still fast and still aggressive. So it rewards like Zoro, it rewards all of the red decks. And I think because it's a 4-life leader and it is a little bit slower, I will put it in competitive. I don't think it's at Leave It Locals. I think you can probably do okay with it at an event. I would consider this probably like a 5-4 deck or like a 6-3 deck. I don't know if it would make it like a 7-2, 8-1, or 9-0, but I think it's very competitive. I might actually put it above Odin if I had to. Next up, we're gonna go with Smoker. I think Smoker is one of those decks that is competitive and towards the top end of the competitive. I don't know if it can go 9 rounds. I can see it doing really well. I think it has a really strong advantage against Whitebeard, but it definitely struggles against Zoro. And I think if the Law player is good, it struggles against Law. And it can beat Kid if it sees what it needs, because Kid is a little bit slower of play. But overall, I don't know if Smoker can make it 9 rounds and win a tournament. It might, so we'll see. But I'm going to put it at the higher tier of competitive, maybe almost an event topper deck. Next up, we have the yellow starter deck, Big Mom. I think this is a competitive deck. I don't think it's an event topper deck. I think what this deck is missing is consistent firepower that like maybe a Katakuri has, right? It's going to be swinging for 5 more often than not, and then towards the end of the game, we'll be starting to swing for 7 once like they've established a little bit more of a board. I do think that the ability to put your triggers in life is really strong, and because of that, I think it's a competitive deck. I don't think it's one where it will be at a locals event and struggle. I think it'll do well into actual treasure cups or regionals. I don't see it winning the entire thing though, just because like yellow's missing a little bit for it for me. At least Big Mom Yellow is missing a little bit for it to really pop off, in my opinion. Next up, we have Ace, the red leader from OP-03. I'm going to put this in an event topper deck. I think it does well against Kid. I think it does well against Magellan. It almost could be an S tier. The problem with Ace is that it does have some glaring weaknesses against some of the decks in the meta, like Katakuri, and you have to play it really well. You have to know the matchups really well. What I love about Ace is that Ace is one of those decks that kind of can be built many different ways. If there's ever going to be sideboarding in the one-piece card game, Ace will benefit from that the most, just because there's so many different ways that you can build it and play it. I've seen a ton of different builds, and I think that makes it a very interesting red leader. I know a lot of people get bored of red, but I do think Ace is one of those that can be fun and will be doing a lot down the road. I think once people kind of figure it out, I think it'll start popping off a little bit more. You might see it in the S tier or like the lower end of the S tier. For now, I think it's an event topper. Nami is one that's in the competitive tier. I don't think it's like better than Croc. Is it better than Doflamingo? I would put it right around here. I'd put it right around the other blue decks. It can defend itself really well. Obviously, people call it the solitaire deck of One Piece, and some people call it the gatekeeper of like B tier. My B tier is a little bit different, obviously, with how I view this. I think you can take it to an event. It can probably win a fair amount of games. I don't think it competes very well against these other decks, these top 6 right now. And I think that it might struggle against like a Smoker or maybe even a Croc. I think what Croc does as a blue deck is probably the strongest blue deck in the meta. So I'm going to put Nami right in between Doflamingo and Croc as a strong deck. I'm not too sure about this. I might put it a little bit lower as we go through the meta, but we'll see. We'll see. Next up is Kuro. I think Kuro is a strong deck. I think it has the potential to be competitive. I think it's probably around... I think it's probably the second strongest green leader. I think Kid being the first. Kuro does something very similar to Kid, but it plays a lot of little weenies on the board, which is fine, I guess. If you're going against Zoro, you might want to see those weenies on the board, but the problem is you're using those to use your leader effect. It can cheese wins. I think it has some really good cheese factor to it. I don't think it's going to be like a really strong deck at the end of OP-03. I think to start off with, it will take some people by surprise. And following up with that, I also think Arlong is one of those that will take some people by surprise. I don't know if it's necessarily super strong. I would probably put it towards the tail end of competitive. I think it has a lot of cheese involved with its triggers, the way that it's basically a Doflamingo, but playing slightly weaker characters. There's definitely ways for you to win with this deck. So I've seen it pop off. I've seen it do really bad. I'm going to put it towards the end of competitive. I don't think it's like a horrible deck, but I don't think it's quite there either. And I don't think we're going to see it very much down the road. So OP-03 is probably its one chance to shine. And I hope somebody does really well with it. It's overall an okay and an interesting leader. I don't think it's going to win an event. So next up we have Iceberg. I'm going to put Iceberg at the free tier. I think Iceberg is one that can cheese wins. Basically all of your characters are 5-cost 6k attackers. The problem is you don't really have much to do with your leader other than like just use the effect. You can't attack, which I think is the big hindrance for this deck. I think the fact that you can't attack with the leader makes this leader F tier. The fact that you're able to at least cheat out bodies kind of makes up for it. However, your Dawn is constantly being spent to do this. You're minusing yourself. If you don't find your stage, then the game's pretty much over from the start. If you do find your stage, it makes it a little bit easier to win. This deck just doesn't feel good playing it though. That's the thing. You're playing this deck and you're kind of like, okay, I'm playing a body down. Oh, my opponent removed my body. Okay, I'm playing another one down. Oh, they removed it. And then eventually you're out of hand size, you're out of cards on the field, and then what are you doing? You're having a staring match with your opponent because you can't attack with your leader. So I'm going to put this at the F tier, and maybe I'm proven wrong with this one as well, but I don't think I will be. Next up, we have Lucci. I think that this deck is competitive. I think it can top an event, I think that it has a really strong matchup against Newgate. And depending on the build, if you're going CP9, which is more of the aggressive build for this deck, or if you're going Navy, which is more of the control build, I think that you can overall do fine with either. I think this deck is pretty strong. I'm going to actually put it above Magellan and maybe below Kid. I think Kid has some advantages overall against like the CP9 version. The Navy version is a little bit different of a story. But yeah, I think that Lucci has room in this meta to do well and could potentially win some tournaments. We have Black Yellow Big Mom. This deck did well in the Asia meta, and I think it has some place in the competitive tier. I'm going to put it below Croc. I think the problem with this is with a lot of the other 4-cost leaders, like for instance, like Z, it is a deck that kind of turtles up and plays a little bit slower and then plays a grind game. If you can make it to that grind game, then you will probably win. However, once again, this meta is for decks that can play aggressive and take life early and kind of control the board with their characters and just establish a lot of dominance early. And because of that, Big Mom doesn't really do that as well, especially with 4 life and playing black and yellow cards. It's a little bit of a struggle. So I'm going to put it in the competitive tier. I think it can do well. I think it might be able to win an event if enough people put to practice into it. But at this time, at the beginning of OP03, I'm going to put it towards the top end of competitive, maybe towards the middle of competitive. So yeah. And then finally, to round it up, I'm going to put Katakuri, I think everyone's favorite new toy, at the top of the event toppers, at the top of A. I think Katakuri is one of those decks that it's basically it took the place of Purple Kaido for this. If you see what you need, you're probably going to do well. It's a high roll deck. But if you don't see what you need, it's going to be a struggle. It does do really poorly against Zoro or decks that rush in. I think it also struggles against Whitebeard too, depending on how you play. But overall, if you can play any of these other decks and then chain Big Moms, which is the whole goal, you're swinging 7 the entire time and then chain Big Mom on 10, then this deck does really well. I think that it has really good matchups across the board other than the meta-defining decks. I think it beats pretty much every other deck in the A tier. And yeah, I think that Katakuri is pretty good. So overall, this is my tier list. I think this is a pretty fair tier list. I would say that the only spicy, quote-unquote, spicy pick that I haven't seen a lot of people put higher up is Magellan. I see people kind of like middle of the road for it. I think Magellan can do well and will do well this set. But what's really interesting is I want to go back at the end of this, at the end of OP03, and do a revision and kind of see where we're at from this. So this is the one right now. We'll come back and we'll do another one later on. I'm curious what you guys think. Was I pretty much spot on with a lot of these, or was I like way off? Please let me know in the comments. Make sure to like and sub also while you're at it. That really helps me out. And make sure to join the Discord. We're growing a One Piece community in the Discord slowly but surely, and I would love to have you there. Let's talk One Piece. So anyways, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.